University Viadrina in Frankfurt. Philipp Hacker is Professor of Law and Ethics of the Digital Society at the European New School of Digital Studies there, whereas Jürgen Neyer is a Professor of European and International Politics. And the topic is Temporalities of Law and Politics. You have 15 minutes. You'll hear a little bling at the 13-minute mark. Ready, set, go.
Well, thanks so much. So let's start straight away. Thanks, first of all, for the invitation to this fascinating workshop. This is really absolutely interesting. It's awesome for us to work here, to present our stuff here. Important reason for that is that's the first time that Philip and me are working together. He's a lawyer specialized in private law. I'm a political science specialized in public policy. So bringing that together is a challenge. It's great. It's absolutely interesting for us. Let's go straight to the paper. Dynamic rights protection. What is that? We have one crucial component in our whole presentation. I'll say two components, two crucial elements. One is temporality, and the second one is substantial smartness. And how we bring that together, we'll do that in 4 steps, basically. We start with Philip saying a little bit about smart city temporalities. What is the challenge? What's the context? We are just situating a paper in. We move then on to the second part, which is titled A Space of Dynamic Contestation. Here we bring some insights from local governance and have some experiences from smart cities. How do they cope with that kind of challenges? Part 3, regulating AI's dynamic. Here we delve into law and see what kind of mechanisms the law provides in order to cope with the temporality of law and how to realize substantial smartness. And then finally, part 4, the most challenging, we try to bring all this together and make something which is comprehensible. I keep it here and move over to Philip. He's having the next input.
Yeah, thanks, Jürgen. Thanks to the organizers also from my side. So again, to recap what Jürgen already said, we're basically grappling with a dual research question. On the one hand, how can we somehow narrow the gap between the pace of technological change and progress on the one hand, and the sluggishness, as it were, of the law on the other hand, that is supposed to regulate these things? And second, and relatedly, how can maybe these answers that we find here contribute to an understanding, a refined understanding of smartness and smart city context? So, but before we can answer this, let's have a look at what temporality really means in smart city context, how we use it. So temporality, of course, refers to change over time, and that can relate to the technology itself. It can relate to the use of that technology, or it can also relate to the use of public infrastructure in the smart city. And we've already heard a bit of about this in the talk by Lottie. So streets, for example, are usually made for walk-in or for drive-in or whatever, driving your bicycle, for pretty mundane activities. But of course, particularly in times of crisis, they can quickly become avenues of political protest, as we've seen in, for example, the BLM protests. Now, this is often accompanied with some change in the way the urban technology is used, and we just alluded to that in the previous discussion. So there's a famous case from San Diego from 2020, precisely from the Black Lives Matter protests, when smart streetlights that were installed initially to collect environmental data and traffic data were then used to track protesters in these BLM protests. So here we can see that really there is quite a dynamic going on time-wise. And similarly, we can imagine another example. Just a few weeks ago, I had to go to the Berlin City Hall to collect my son's passport, and I just rang this old-fashioned bell. And I was identified afterwards. You know, I had to show my passport, and then I had to wait for a couple of hours before I could collect the passport. Now, if you think about, if you're a city official, you think about, you know, smarting your city, you might think about, you know, let's do this via face recognition technology. I'm automatically recognized, no need to identify myself with any kind of official directly to the gates, and hopefully not waiting for a couple of hours for the passport. Now, before we do this, of course, we should give it a moment of pause. And as many of you have already stressed, you know, there are severe problems of non-discrimination, particularly with respect to face recognition technology, abundant evidence shows that it underperforms vastly for ethnic minorities and also for certain gender types, particularly for the female gender. So if you happen to be a Black activist, or not even an activist, just a Black woman, and you want to collect your passport, you might be refused entry to the city hall, whilst that is not the case with an average white middle-aged male guy like myself. So the installment of these components, oftentimes without really thinking through the consequences that they may have, is akin to what we would call technocratic smartness. How can we try to respond to this? Well, we want to develop here a concept of substantive smartness. And what does that mean? Substantive smartness branches out in two dimensions. On the one hand, in politics, we look at strategies that are external to the law, such as activism or local implementations, that could be summed up under the term of participatory smartness. And that's what Jürgen is going to talk about in the next part of this presentation. And in the law, I'm going to try to highlight some strategies internal to the law to cope with temporality, and at the same time, that contribute at the same time to HR respecting smartness. So with that, I'll hand over again to Jürgen for the second part.
Thanks so much, Philip. So space of dynamic contestation, what is that? And we're talking here, of course, about smart cities. That is the space we just situate our analysis in. Why cities? Well, that's, I think, important point. Legislation often is pretty slow and sluggish, and local implementation is the site where you just, first of all, where you see when problems really emerge. That's when you face the situation that you have been denied access to a building, or that's the situation where you see the sensors on the street, where you see the cameras on the street, where you see the surveillance. All this happens in cities. So cities are important. And if cities are important as sites of new technological development, then it's quite obvious that it would be a good idea to have citizens, not just for democratic, but also for functional reasons, as watchdogs and at the same time as policy engineers. So bring them into the driver's seats of realizing the temporality of law. There's a second argument, and that is the argument of strong democracy. Benjamin Barber, some of you might have heard that kind of literature. Democracy, if we can evoke that in a local context, that is the site where you can have the most democratic, the most direct democratic kind of political procedures. We could combine that with digitally networked action, the idea by Bennett and Zagerberg. If we bring that together, the digital space to a local urban context, then we might have something like the components of a new kind of democratic process. That, of course, has been hotly debated in the literature, and there's many problems with that. So three of the important terms, which are again and again being discussed here, are tokenism, elitism, and silencing. So the avenues which are pretty often offered for citizens in local platforms, in local fora for bringing in concerns, raising your critical voice, they often look more as if they were offers than they were real offers. Elitism is a second crucial point. It is most often people like Philipp, Lottie, and me who are just engaging in that kind of critical engagement, but it hardly ever covers the whole population. Silencing also is an important case. If you're not sure about what is being surveyed, what is being stored, what is being collected, this might have a silencing effect on you. So the big question then is, if we move in a urban, local, digital, smart context, how can we activate local democracy in here? How can we activate ownership? How can we bring the people into the driver's seat? And here we draw from three experiences, that is Barcelona, Toronto, and Frankfurt-Oder. So you might wonder, how is this weird kind of case selection coming together? Well, Barcelona is a hot case, most often being debated for its innovativeness, for its openness, for its reaching out to the citizen, its ownership, largely being distributed among the population. Toronto is often being discussed as a kind of massive failure, a top-down project which tried to land in that city, which was rejected then more or less by the population. There was a strong critique against that. Alphabet, the company which was trying to implement that, has withdrawn from it now. And well, Frankfurt-Oder is so interesting because it's just different. It's a provincial city. We're talking not about Frankfurt Main, the other Frankfurt in Germany. We're talking about Frankfurt Oder, 60,000 inhabitants at the eastern border of Germany, located closely to Poland. It is, well, we call it the unintended. So that's the three cases which we have: the good, the bad, and the unintended. And what we see from the analysis of these three cases is basically three insights. I got to be very brief. It's only 5 minutes left here. Pragmatism. Second point is hybridity. And the third important lesson, which we draw from it, is ownership. So if you want to have an activated citizenry, you need to have pragmatic, not too visionary project. You have the hybrid forms of localism, which means you got to cover the analog and the digital world, bring it onto the streets, what you do online, and ownership is reach out to the people, bring them in as much as possible. If you do that, if you make strong efforts of doing that, you have a good and fair chance to enlarge democracy onto those people and to bring them into the role of being both watchdogs and policy entrepreneurs. I keep it here and hand over to Philip again.
Thanks. And we actually have a pretty interesting data set on this, but more perhaps in the discussion, as it were. So now turning from participatory smartness to HR respecting smartness in the context of the law, of course, we want to look at the classics. HR respecting smartness should safeguard data protection, non-discrimination, and also the rights flowing from the AI Act. Just going to zip through this a little bit because time is of the essence here again. But we should also note that HR respecting smartness should, of course, take temporality into account, technological change, and the sluggishness of the law. What are the three strategies within the law to cope with that kind of temporality? Well, the first one I would call direct temporal regulation. So if you already know what you're talking about, what kind of developments might occur, you can directly regulate them. Like the AI Act says, no social scoring based on AI in Europe. Then if that's not the case, because you cannot really foresee it, you might have temporality by interpretation. So at least you can interpret some concepts in the law in a way that makes reference to and accommodates this kind of temporality. And failing that, third, you can at least, or additionally, establish review obligations. And we've already seen a bit of this in Lottie's talk, and I will also share some insights about this. Okay, to be real quick, let's have some examples here. Temporality in the GDPR is interesting because the substance of the GDPR is, of course, characterized by a risk-based approach. And that means, as all of you probably know, that the higher the risk of the processing operation, the higher the regulatory burden. Now, the interesting part with respect to temporality is that this also includes new risks that were not foreseeable when the processing was started, or obviously also not foreseeable when the GDPR was even enacted. So to talk about, again, about this function creep example of smart street lights being used for law enforcement, if that happens in the EU, the data controller, so most likely some city agency or whatever, needs to face these new threats and needs to accommodate these new risks by offering new mitigation strategies, data protection by design, IT security, particularly in new data protection impact assessment, to make sure that there is no unauthorized access by third parties. Police might be different. We can discuss this in the discussion if you'd like, but just saying that these new risks that emerge, they can still be accommodated within the risk-based approach. So here we have what I'd call adaptive regulation. Regulation adapts to new risks emerging. How about non-discrimination? How about the case of, face recognition technology denying access? Well, it's pretty clear that if, a Black woman is refused entry because of her color of skin, for example, that constitutes discrimination. But what about a city council that merely announces to install face recognition technology? Can we then already, because of the risk of future discrimination, can we then already stop that? That would be interesting, I believe. And there is something to support this in recent case law, actually a case decided in 2020 by the CJU that said that, well, announcements of discrimination can count as discrimination if there is a concrete relationship to a real future act of discrimination, if that relationship is not merely hypothetical. In our case, you would have to look probably particularly at the training data. So if they say they're going to install a system by, let's say, Google, and Google's FRT database is known to underrepresent certain ethnic minorities, then you could say, well, this is very likely to result in discrimination. Let's stop it here. And potential victims would actually have an injunctive forward-looking relief against the city council. So that would be a case of implicit temporal interpretation of the concept of discrimination. We also have explicit temporal interpretation. I can't go into this for time reasons, but that would be personal data in the GDPR, for example. Finally, temporality and the AI Act. Again, I can only offer a snapshot. One aspect that I wanted to highlight is the risk management system, but that was already covered by Lottie nicely. Thanks for that, so we can skip over that. That's what I would call compliance temporality review. So the regulatee has to perform this iterative assessment, but at the same time, the entire AI Act needs to be evaluated regularly by the legislators and potentially adapted. So that's what I would call legislative temporality review. Can I have just 1 minute to finish this, to have a look at the converging temporalities, politics and the law? It's only 1 slide, really.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks. So we'll try to tie the knots together here because, of course, on the one hand, we have these mechanisms like digitally network actions. We have the mechanisms in the law to deal to some extent with this temporality and to foster to some extent substantive smartness. But there are many problems, of course, that remain. So, for example, if we think about DNAs, and that is digitally network actions, such as using social media and other formats for political participation, we know that these media are haunted by, hate speech, abuse, all these difficult issues. There is obviously regulation that is necessary, and the EU is currently passing, as you know, the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and we'll see how that fares. More on this in the discussion if you'd like. I can only mention this here, of course. What's more interesting, perhaps, is that local enforcement is becoming possible with the very recent April 22 judgment of the CJU in Meta versus the VZBV, that's the German Consumer Protection Association. You can found on the local level consumer protection associations and sue for GDPR breaches wherever they occur and with EU-wide impact. And that, I think, is quite a step forward to motivate and to make possible local activism on the legal level. And third, and that's my final point, that could also work with a certain twist for non-discrimination law, but it does certainly not work for the AI Act, because the AI Act in its format right now does not confer subjective rights. And therefore, here we need human rights activism, we need watchdogs to flag the issues, and there are many, believe me, with the AI Act, and in order to really move forward and move the discourse forward. So summing this up, law can help politics in some areas, but we also need politics to help the law in other areas. So with this, we're at the end, and for the sake of time, I'll just leave the conclusions open here for a second. Many thanks for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.